All right, thanks, Matt. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, good morning, everyone. So Dr. Maidment regrets that he was not able to be here, but Andy and I are just going to do our best to channel him, and his visionary thinking is very much at the heart of this work that we're doing. So our topic is real-time flood emergency response for the Texas Department of Transportation. And we were hit really hard by Hurricanes Harvey and Tropical Storms Imelda. And those experiences became a really big driver for us to pursue this work, which is actually the single largest research project that TxDOT has ever done. And from my perspective, our research program is very much about advancing the state of knowledge and the state of practice, not just for Texas and TxDOT, but for really all of our partners, whether they're local governments within Texas, state agencies, or the national community. And as we'll discuss a little bit later, those partnerships have really been critical to the success. And we've learned a lot from you guys. So you'll hear later the Feynman-T presentation. We're really grateful to North Carolina for the inspiration that you guys have provided. And the Harris County Flood Control District in the Houston area has also provided a lot of inspiration for us in how to solve some of these problems. So the simple goal is to determine the limits of flooding on TxDOT roadways. And of course, that's not a simple thing to do. And it's really been especially interesting for me coming into my role in June 2020 and being handed this huge project and realizing, my group has actually never been involved with the flood emergency management response for this agency. So we really had to figure out how to identify all the partners within a 12,000 person agency. And I think a lot of you know what that's like. And then I think another thing to call out about just this project, I think we're in a really special time of technical readiness. And so this project really is what the moment demands of us. So we just had to figure out how we were going to do this work. And while we're really focused on the real-time flood emergency management side of things, we're also able to, through this type of work, better focus on post-event scour response. And then there are also a lot of benefits for design and planning, so really understanding the hydraulic performance of our roadways and the resilience of the network as a whole.
Okay. I'm not going to use the mic. Can you hear me in the back? I'm a Texan, so I speak a little loud and a little voice. So do you need a recording? Yeah. The guys are telling me I need to use it. I don't like a lectern. That's the consulting engineer in me. I want to wave my hands. This is the National Water Model. I don't know if anybody really knows what this is being done. This is being done out of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. What it is it's a continuously operating hydrologic simulation of the continental United States. There's 2.7 million reaches across the entire United States, where every hour they're calculating a hydrologic discharge. Every hour. Okay? The accuracy is improving as time goes on. It's going to get better and better as we keep working on it. The National Weather Service does. But what you need to know is that every reach has got a discharge that's being calculated. So it's very likely of all of y'all sitting out there in your state that there are bridges and culverts where there is a discharge that is being calculated every hour. And that's being done by this massive continental scale supercomputer hydrologic simulation that's going on. Okay? So if you don't know it, it's time to start learning. It's 24/7, it's running all the time, and it's giving us hourly discharges. This is going to be very critical to our work as we move forward, so we're going to talk about this a bit later.
So this is research, and we went into it having some ideas about how we were going to pursue the project and what we thought was possible, but also really not knowing a lot of questions about what the unknowns were and how to resolve them. And we're just completing the second year of this 3-year project. So we want to share a few highlights from the different major components of the work. The first one is these non-contact radar stream gauges, and the USGS is our partner on this. We know that for forecasting, we need real ground truth data. And so the primary questions that we were working around were how to best site a network of gauges to support the real-time flood modeling and mapping. And then also, this new technology of non-contact radar gauges and really what can they do, what are their limits, what are the maintenance requirements. The second component, the reliability of the water surface elevation. So we know that that's a big question. We have the inaccuracy of the rainfall forecast to begin with, and then the inaccuracies of how do we actually route and understand water surface elevations. So really trying to explore those interrelationships between the National Water Model, the river forecast centers, and how we get the most accurate and high resolution information focused on the transportation network and the local accuracy. The third part, the information portal. We knew that it was a non-trivial area of work to really figure out how we were going to serve the information to all the relevant users, and that also relates to the fourth component, which is the emergency management side of things. So really wanting to connect with those end users on emergency management to make sure that we understood what their data needs were, and that once we made this an implementable system, that it would actually be adopted. So, non-contact radar stream gauges. Do you
You
want
want me to do that one? So we ended up installing 80, as part of this project, 80 RQ30 contactless stream gauges. So the idea of the National Water Model is predicated off of the fact that you've got USGS gauges that are in operation. That's what's informing and kind of reinforcing some of these calculations that are being done. The more gauges you add, the better that model's going to get. And the more gauges that it assimilates, the better it's going to make calculations hydrologically. So we put 80 of them. Trying to figure out where to put them spatially is tough. One of the things that we were able to do, because these gauges are a little smaller, is that we can install them on smaller watersheds and start learning something at a smaller scale. So if you look, we've got 8 of them that are less than 15 square miles. The USGS's head might explode if we told them that we were originally going to install gauges on streams that were that small. But because these things are smaller, we actually have that flexibility. And that's kind of the great thing about these installations. The other good thing is with Rose Marie, we've realized that these 80 gauges are going to be owned, operated, and maintained in the long term by the USGS. And that's important because they're an agency that does a really good job of maintaining gauges, checking them, fixing them, updating. The maintenance cost, I think, is actually higher than the installation cost itself over the long term. So some agency needs to own and maintain these, but these gauges have some abilities that Rose Marie's going to talk about that do some things that a traditional USGS gauge does not. So let her get into that.
Thanks, Andy. So my big ask was cite these gauges in the way that we're going to learn the most from them, because I'm flexible like that. We also looked at where do we already have a lot of gauge density. So we decided to focus on the coastal area of Texas because the central Texas area has a high density as well as urban areas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And that coastal area was also a big focus due to Tropical Storm Imelda and Hurricane Harvey. So we know that the USGS has really stringent standards on data quality, and there's long experience with what we think of as traditional gauges. So we wanted to understand how, what these RQ30 gauges could do, and Andy mentioned the cost. So each unit has a capital cost of about around $15,000. So definitely the O&M far exceeds the long-term O&M cost. So these gauges, as you can see, hopefully the figure on the middle top, they measure stage, so the up-down measurement, and they measure velocity, so at an angle. They can be mounted either on the upstream or the downstream side of a bridge, and they cannot withstand being inundated, which was a hard lesson we learned early on. There are some initial measurements that hopefully you can see the little flow chart here on the bottom left. So the purple boxes are some initial measurements that we make when the gauges are installed. So we take a cross-section of the stream, we understand something about the relationship of the mean velocity to a point velocity, and then the orange peach-colored boxes also on the left side represent the continuous measurements that the unit takes. And then the yellow boxes represent the calculated variables and parameters, so the cross-section of the flow area and the mean velocity, ultimately leading to the discharge value. So the right photograph is just an example of what that installation looks like. So point velocity. So the gauge is reading velocity at a single point on the surface, and you can imagine that that point is pretty noisy due to turbulence, waves and ripples, debris, other factors. So that heavy blue line is the level of noise that's actually at a single point that's being measured, and you hopefully can see there's a red line there also that's a little bit lighter in weight, and that's really looking at how that noise is sort of canceled out by the unit. And then we have the learned velocity. So the gauge is actually continuously improving. So you can see on the left side of this graph how the red line is actually tracking more of the noisiness of it, and then it sort of smooths itself out as time goes on. It's learning to identify a more appropriate mean velocity for the stream. The team was delightfully surprised to also see how these gauges can teach us things in tidally influenced areas and in backwater areas. So you can see from the chart on the top that whereas we typically think of stage and velocity as being directly related, there's an inverse relationship in these tidal areas. So where stage is high, velocity is low, and vice versa. But that's when it's tidally influenced. You can see at the end, the top right, how there are circumstances where the stage gets high and the velocity get high. So we know that that's actually not a tidal flow that's coming. You may or may not be able to see there are actually two lines in that top right. So there's a light blue line and a light green line. So this is a location where we have both an RQ30 installed and a traditional USGS gauge. And we can see what we're finding is that the stream levels that are being measured are pretty much spot on. Like, they're within a very acceptable tolerance. We're talking about 1/100 of a foot type of accuracy or relative similarity. And then on the bottom, we can see how important the velocity measurement is to understanding the flow rate. So there's the thick blue line and then a point where the red line diverges from a light blue line. That light blue line is the discharge that's computed using the traditional rating curve and stage. But when we look at the velocity, we actually compute a completely different flow rate. So we're understanding how backwater is actually influencing what is happening in the stream. And then the last thing I wanted to share on this topic is one of our newer areas of exploration. We're really excited to see that there's a significant increase in velocity and this peak that happens in advance of the peak of the flood wave. And so we're currently exploring, under what circumstances this is occurring and how do we know which systems this happens on, and is that potentially a way to understand peak stage?
So on the rising leg, we'll see a spike in velocity before we see a spike in water surface elevation, right? I mean, I think we all know that computationally that should happen. But that actually gives us a precursor warning, like, hey, a flood's coming. The velocity just picked up. Something's about to happen. So you can think about that as almost like reading the tea leaves if you're trying to do prediction on your networks. What's interesting on the right is this is a colleague of mine that did this work. He has a synthetic simulation, and we were able to replicate the same thing. So it was just a prismatic channel. But you can see the hysteresis, the looped rating curve on the rising leg and the kind of coming back. Then you also get that temporal shift. So we just wanted to confirm that we were seeing the same thing. So computationally, we are seeing what we're seeing in the real world, and we can kind of replicate it. So that's important. Anybody know where Brenham, Texas is? Show of hands. Have you ever been to Brenham, Texas? They are home of what? Does anybody know? Bluebell ice cream comes from Brenham, Texas. We have a laboratory out there. We're calling it the Brenham Laboratory. It's 150 square miles, but it's 3 nested RQ30 gauges. What we're trying to do there is what we talked about with the National Water Model, that we can't put a gauge everywhere because we can't afford it. But with Kalman filtering, we think we can go through some processes and start informing the network that, if the discharge is something at one of those yellow dots, one of the blue lines should have a number about this. So that's reinforcing. So it's not a replace and route, much like the National Water Model does. We're trying to figure out algorithms that will do assimilation to reinforce the streams, both upstream and downstream, the predictions as we go. So we're working on computational algorithms right now. That's a work in progress. But we hope that having these gauges installed, and specifically having the Brenham Laboratory nested, we have to pray for a horrible rain event there to really test it, which is kind of a horrifying thing to say out loud, but that's going to help. So what have we done up to this point? So this is the flooded roads that we did for Rosemarie in the Beaumont district. We did a rain-on-grid 2D simulation of QPE precipitation over an area the size of New Jersey. And I ran it on my desktop machine, and it did take a while. Once we did that, we started getting flooded roads. This is the inspiration from the Feynman-T guys to try to give them a colorization as to how deep the water is. You'll see that when they talk about it. We got this idea from them. The 2D simulation is really easy to do with retrospective, meaning we can go back to the National Water Model, get discharges, we can go get the QPE from the National Weather Service. We can go back in time and look at anything we want. That doesn't help for emergency management, right? I mean, I can't crank for hours and hours and hours. We have a problem, but we'll get to that in a second. So we mentioned earlier that I'm the father of something called RAS-DeFem. RAS-DeFem is open source. I wrote that for the National Weather Service. Anybody can go grab it. It will work anywhere that you've got really detailed HEC-RAS 1D models, okay? What it does is if you've got a detailed hydraulic model and you've got detailed terrain, most of us have detailed terrain because the USGS 3-depth service is serving terrain via web coverage service. You can calc a synthetic rating curve. So for every stream reach in the National Water Model, you get a rating curve that's reach averaged depth as a function of discharge. That's what's on the right. So the idea is the National Water Model is going to give us a broadcasted stream flow. We're going to look up against that synthetic rating curve. This is actually done in Iowa. We have really good detailed 1D models over the entire state of Iowa. We got a flood inundation depth grid, and from that, really all we're trying to pull out for each one of those rhombuses on the far right, a red line that says what the flooded road actually is. Right? So we know with this discharge, this road is flooded this much. We calc that for every rhombus as we go up for every stream with an entire watershed on a Huck 8 scale, Huck 4 scale, Huck 2 scale. I mean, it's just a scalable calculation. This is a really important slide to digest. If you only digest anything from this presentation, think about this. I think we all know it and we're here. The National Water Model operates at hand right now, which is height above nearest drainage. That is really cheap to compute, and it's done on a continental scale, and it's already been calculated. So it's a way to figure out flood depth inundation as a function of discharge, and it's the easiest, cheapest, quickest way to do it. You start climbing up the ladder, and you go, well, wait a minute, my community has spent millions and millions of dollars on flood insurance models, on 1D models. Lots, right? What can you should be using those for flood inundation if you have them. Right now, the National Water Model is using hand. With some of the work I'm doing, they're starting to convert the existing FEMA grade 1D models and some other stuff into flood inundation maps. And then you got 2D models. 2D models are expensive, they're hard to run, they take a long time. Right? If anybody's run them, you know it's like watching paint dry. It's kind of like the old school days of HEC 2 where you would turn in your card stack and you'd wait and wait and wait and wait and realize, oh, I messed up that number, and you do it again, right? 2D is kind of the equivalent for the younger folks the same way, that you run it and you finally get the answer and it's not good. What's happened with HEC-RAS 2D? HEC-RAS 2D, there is now a Linux open source engine to compute it, which is awesome, because now you can run it on AWS. You don't have to run it on a Windows machine. You have to build the model on a Windows machine, but you don't have to run it. You can run it on a Linux system. Anybody tried running HEC-RAS 2D on a Linux system yet? I have. You should try it. It's an interesting go, but there's a problem. Right now, HEC-RAS 2D will run on as many computational cores as you have. So my machine's got 8 cores. It'll run on all 8 cores. It takes a while. The TAC is one of the largest supercomputers on the planet, well, at least in the United States, it's publicly acknowledged. That's right next door to our offices at UT. Okay? What it has is it has a machine with 128 cores. So one of those little machines has 128 cores. What it won't do is it won't run across multiple machines at the same time. UT is working on that, and in 2 years we think we're going to be able to add that to HEC's code where we can scale it. What we could do then is we could run rain-on-grid simulations within minutes, not within hours, for Huck 8s, Huck 6s, right? I mean, honestly, if you can get it across multiple machines, you can run it. So it's coming. We're not ready for prime time yet. This is that rain-on-grid simulation. Anybody see the problem? We do that on bare earth DEMs. What's happening there is, I'll point it out. It's saying the road's flooded, but guess what? There's bridges there. There's bridges there. So we're running all of our simulations on bare earth DEMs, right? And it's telling us that, hey, that road is flooded. It's not. We all know it's not. There's a bridge there. How do you fix that? There's something that I'm proposing that's called a healed terrain. Healed terrain is the bare earth plus the bridge added back in. So when you run your simulation, your computational model, you're going to do it on the bare earth. When you delineate it on the bare earth DEM. And if you do that, you'll know if that bridge is overtopped or not. That's an easy ask to do, but computationally, you've got to go scrape the data and do that. We have open source code. We've developed a package called Texas Bridge. Texas Bridge will pull that data and do it for you. And it works for anywhere that you've got USGS 3-depth classified point clouds. So if your bridges are classified, in Georgia, they are beautifully classified. In Iowa, the older data, I've struggled. In Kentucky, where they had recent floods, I struggled. They're not as well classified. So you have to look and figure out what kind of data you've got. But if it's well classified, you can pull it. Programmatically, you pull the point clouds. And from the point clouds, you can get the top of the bridge deck. I mean, I think we all know this is here. The problem is, when you model lots and lots and lots and lots of bridges, you have to do this as a manual process. And what we're proposing is that you can do this completely as an automated procedure, that you can just kick off a machine and so find all the bridges. So we start hunting. This is exactly what I'm proposing, is you've got the bare earth, which is what you run the simulation against, but when you map it with the bridge added back in on the healed terrain. Hopefully that makes sense. It's not a complicated idea. It's hard to put together programmatically, but it's not a complicated idea. So this is bulk bridge harvesting, right? In my mind, I'm thinking, I need to find all the bridges. I need to tell the machine to go find all the bridges. So it goes and hits the USGS 3-depth service, and it finds all the bridges. It finds all the point clouds that are classified as a bridge, wraps a polygon around them, and you're going, well, that's cool. I could link that to all my national bridge inventory stuff. Oh, somebody's trying to come in. I can link this to all my national bridge inventory stuff and get something that we're calling a bridge envelope. So we get a major access line. That's coming from a transportation network. Hopefully your agency has good vectored line work. We've got a digital elevation model of the terrain that we've gotten from the deck, and we've got the bridge deck. What we don't know is we don't know the thickness of the bridge deck. That either has to be supplied by well, right now we're trying to do that with a rubric coming from the National Bridge Inventory. So if we're doing it automatically, they're just going to tell me that this bridge is about 4 foot thick, and if we're doing it at scale. Now, if we've got surveys, yeah, that should win. If we don't have surveys for all the bridges, which I don't know any agency that realistically has a survey for every bridge, but maybe some of the smaller states do. This is RAS to FEM. This is open source. If you want to play with it, this is how I get the flood raster stacks. I'm going to hit this very quick and go on because there's a lot of detail here, but the cool thing is we can also do this against the healed terrain. Right, so we can give raster stacks against that. You can go find this on GitHub. It's all public open source code. RAS, the number 2, FIM, RAS to FIM. So, and that's the QR code if you want to try to figure out how to get there, if you want to run the code yourself. So there's that synthetic grading curve, and each one of those has a flood inundation raster stack, and you can see where the bridges are not being flooded. This is, if anybody's been to Austin, this is on the west side on Shoal Creek. And you can tell that 15th Street is not flooded. We got a blue line for the stream center line. I'm going to let Rosemary talk about that. That's a lot of technical shotgunning. I hope you got a little bit out of that.
And there's so much more to say about it. How are we doing on time? About 3 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through some of these highlights. Really, just needless to say, the partnerships are critical, and we've really carefully curated our project oversight and project management committee to include a lot of our partners that have the technical experience. We're a transportation agency. We don't have an armada of, we're never going to be forecasting the weather. We don't have an armada of watershed modelers. We're not flood forecasters. And it's really been a beautiful thing to see all the partners, really show up and figure out, I think everyone recognizes, if you're producing hydrologic predictions for hydrologists, you're really not realizing the impact of the community. And the transportation network is a really critical component of how we all understand and what success looks like in emergency management and what people are interested in having communicated to them. So one of the key takeaways from this is really just this idea that we are utilizing our partners and developing shared services so that information can be aggregated and shared easily amongst different entities, including within our own agency. So we were really wanting to focus on what are the tools that are already being used for emergency management. Let's not create new things. Let's actually have ways to easily plug in to the existing framework. And also, what information do emergency managers really need? So what will make this really useful and meaningful to them? And our partners have been really receptive to that. So the National Weather Service wants to know, what do you guys actually want us to give you? And our emergency management people say, we don't need the 3-page thing, we need the 1-page thing, and we need it to include this, this, and this. So I'll leave it at that. And then do you want to hit, Andy, the local?
What's that?
Do you want to hit that one?
This is kind of we've got a lot of stuff, but let's get to the last one. So this is kind of something I did in Fulton County's got beautiful H&H models. I don't know if anybody's here from Fulton County, but their models are awesome. So here's kind of a scenario that would happen in your community. Let's play it out. So we're all sitting here, and all of a sudden my phone goes off, and it gives me an alert, and it says, hey, stream, then there's a stream number, 34285770 is going to flood, and it's going to flood this much. So computationally behind the scenes, it looks at that raster stack, and it says, this is on the west side of Atlanta, by the way. This is at the industrial district on the west side. and it will say, hey, I pulled that flood raster stack, and guess what? That road's going to flood 4 feet, and that road's going to have a little bit of bypass of a foot. And that's what Rose Marie would dispatch to her emergency maintenance folks about throwing up barricades and doing that kind of stuff. This can be done at scale. I did this in about an hour and a half just to prove that it can be done anywhere in the United States where you've got good data, including your own communities. So hopefully you can take some of this and start employing kind of similar methodologies to what you're doing. Thanks.
And that's what we've got. And I think we don't have any time for questions. So, one question. So, do you want to say anything about our conclusions before we just take questions?
Say anything about what?
Our conclusions before we just take questions?
No, I think y'all can read them. So,
all right. Any questions? One question. They're quiet. All right. We did it. Thanks, everyone. And you can find Andy and us anytime if you want to talk more about it.